of this motion is to try and silence the member from Brantford-Brant for being effective at asking tough questions. Did those questions offend somebody? Maybe. Did those questions call into question a member's conduct? Maybe. But what I think we need to remember, Mr. Chair, is that we have to be allowed to ask those tough questions. So one thing that I believe bears mentioning, Mr. Chair, is that over the course of my close to 4.5 years that I've had the honour of serving as a member of Parliament in the constituency of Battle River Crowfoot, beautiful area of East Central Alberta, is I've had been able to ask some of those tough questions, been able to do my best to represent the people that sent me here, understanding full well that that doesn't make everybody happy. And I've faced some criticisms at different points in time, as I would suggest we all have if we're honest about the role that we play. And as a member of the opposition, one of the fundamental roles of that, and in fact it was Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre, when asked by President Biden about what it was to be the leader of His Majesty's loyal opposition. It was an interesting conversation. It was picked up on camera. And Mr. Poilievre made mention of the fact that in Canada, the act of opposition is an act of loyalty. And I think that's very, very profound. That just because we disagree doesn't mean that we aren't passionate about the future of our country. Just because we have disagreements or different policy ideas or whatever the case is, you can really fill in the blank. But what has been a troubling trend that we've seen under these Liberals, so with the support of the NDP, it seems at any cost, which is a troubling metric in and of itself, especially because that's not what Canadians voted for, but is that the Liberals do not want an opposition. They make that clear on a regular basis. Instead, Mr. Chair, they seem to only want an audience. And what's so disconcerting about that is that the very fundamental basis of the institution in which we are all a part of, the House of Commons, was built upon that idea that you could have opposition, whether that be 8+ centuries ago when it was the people wanting to call account of the crown, and instead of fighting a battle which would have seen death and destruction, they came to a point where they could have arguments. Whether that be the many instances where throughout the history of our Parliament where we have been able to have disagreements, and then there are, Chair, times where we do come together. And my colleague, Mr. Barrett, talked about how when it comes to a bill, C-70, that has been introduced to address, in fact, substantively, is something that does address aspects of foreign election interference. So it's a fitting and very relevant to the topic at hand here. Conservatives were quick to make suggestion that there was the ability for us to come together and figure out a way to ensure that that was passed, so that prior to the next election, our intelligence apparatus in this country would be prepared to ensure that the integrity of our electoral framework was in fact protected. So I know, and I'm sure those watching will often think that see that there's those highlighted examples where MPs oppose each other, and that's fair. And I know certainly my constituents have made it very clear to me that I am to oppose the Liberal agenda, oppose it, and do so loudly. In fact, I hear that on a regular basis. But there are those instances where we do work together. So it's not to suggest that that doesn't happen. But what is so important is for that freedom to take place, which leads me into some of the conversation around the idea of privilege. We have before us a motion that suggests that there was a violation of a member's privilege. And I'll get into some of the substance of the motion here in a moment, but I would just a note for Mr. Baines, and maybe he would like to address the reason why there's actually a factual error, I believe, Mr. Chair, in the motion, and it's suggesting that the conversation took place on a day that I don't believe there was actually a meeting. The May 23rd, I believe that the committee was previously occupied during that day. I may stand to be corrected on that. I would certainly appreciate if Mr. Baines had the opportunity when he is able to take the floor to address the specifics of that day. But what Mr. Baines is suggesting is that asking tough questions is somehow a violation of his privilege as an MP. I had mentioned page 57 of the third edition of House of Commons Procedure and Practice and its descriptor of parliamentary privilege. And I would like to further, in that third edition, read from page 88 that says members individually have the responsibility not to abuse their rights and immunities, particularly freedoms of speech. And what I would suggest is being highlighted in the debate we're having here is the fact that we have the responsibility as members of Parliament to not abuse the privileges, but also we cannot abuse the ability and the idea of privilege to be able to weaponize that sort of thing for the purposes of silencing one's critics. And it leads me to the inevitable conclusion that, as I mentioned before, that it is not about whether or not that members' rights and privileges were violated, but I would suggest that that member was facing pressure because of the conversation that took place. And quite frankly, Mr. Chair, I would say that is a good thing. That's what democracy is supposed to be about. It is meant to be a space where we can have and ask and have those tough conversations. But here we are, where there is an attempt through a procedural mechanism, and for those who might be watching that are wondering what a procedural mechanism is, it's using the rules that exist for us to be able to fulfill our functions, using it for something that it was not intended to be used for, in order to, in this case, the member from Brantford-Brant, who is a very effective prosecutor in terms of calling out some of the things that the government has done wrong, using those mechanisms, not for their purpose of the ability for committees to function properly, not for the purposes of protecting members' freedoms of speech, but rather to narrowly interpret privilege as something to silence an opponent. Now, if you could just imagine for a moment, Mr. Chair, what it would be like if during an election you had a national party leader tell one of his opponents that they can or cannot talk about something. It'd be a national scandal. It would be truly a national scandal. We have free, fair, and open discourse because that's what Canadians expect us to be able to have. And that is something that needs to be extended to committee. Now, there have been some accusations made about intent, and there have been further suggestions that somehow that it is incorrect for members to call out these certain things, and I've faced the consequences personally of calling out things that I have deemed to be absolutely egregious, including conduct of the Prime Minister, and I respected, in that case, the Speaker's ruling on that matter. While I disagreed and stand behind what I said, I understood the consequences of that. But, Chair, where we have come today is that are we going to set a precedent that suggests that instead of being able to have these tough conversations, that we are going to allow for procedural mechanisms to be able to take away the ability, rather, for any member of this place to be able to do their work. And I want to highlight something here that I think is often forgotten. We have the principle, and something that is unique to the Westminster system, actually. And part of the reason why, for those who I've had the opportunity to engage with on the matter, is part of the reason why I like the Westminster system of parliament so much is the idea of parliamentary supremacy. And it's key because it ultimately ensures that people have the ultimate say. And although there's an extensive conversation that could be had about that, I want to park that larger conversation because it can get fairly philosophical, and there's differences of opinions rather about when and where and how some of the mechanisms that exist have been brought to bear, both in the context of the Canadian circumstances, where we have both written and unwritten aspects of our Constitution, versus the United Kingdom, where it is still largely unwritten in terms of the constitutional frameworks that exist. And I've talked a little bit about that here and at other committees in the past. But what is key is that it is members of Parliament that make up a Parliament. So for individuals who might be watching, Mr. Chair, I believe it's worth highlighting something that is often forgotten. We are in the 44th Parliament. Now, one might ask, well, what is a Parliament? Well, we often refer to that as a building. In the case of the House of Commons, the chamber with its green floors and the question period and the debates and whatnot. But what's interesting, Chair, is that a Parliament is actually the description of it is the place where a group of MPs are able to come together, which form that Parliament. And then out of that, in the case of our tradition, this is tradition, and has become constitutional convention, the party that gets the most seats is able to form the government, of which the government is the cabinet led by the Prime Minister, which, interestingly, the history of that is that the Prime Minister was the first minister among ministers that refer to in the Latin history of the word, the first among equals, although that's certainly been something that's been long since abandoned. But what's interesting, Chair, and this bears, I think, an important point to be made, is that is not simply applicable to members of the opposition. When I describe our democratic system to classes, whether it's junior high, high school, or even some elementary classes, I talk about every person being allowed to have every Canadian being allowed to have that one ballot on election day. That is an incredible thing. That right we have is an incredible privilege, hard fought for and won over history. And the fact that the current Prime Minister or the leader of a political party, any political party, they get the same number of ballots on election day. It's incredible. The power to choose your government, every Canadian getting that one ballot. And I asked the question about how many ballots you get on election day. It's interesting, some of the conversations that ensue in classrooms about that, because it is that distribution of authority to the people that truly is fundamental in the way that our democratic system operates. Now, although I would be the first to admit that that's not always equitable in terms of the number of individuals per electoral district, and there's always nuances in the conversation, but fundamentally it comes down to every Canadian gets that one ballot on election day. Powerful thing. And I know for you, Chair, this would be the same thing. You and I and all members of this committee, including staff and technical folks, they get to have that one ballot to make a choice about who gets to represent them in the House of Commons. But here's the extension of that, and why parliamentary supremacy is so key. That one ballot translates into, in the case of our current Parliament, 338 seats. Now, another question I ask students when I have the chance to speak with them is that how many seats does the Prime Minister occupy in the House of Commons? And again, it's interesting, some of the responses that I get. But it comes down to one. I ask the same of the Leader of the Opposition. They occupy one seat in the House of Commons. And in the case of our current Parliament, there are 338 members of Parliament that sit and make decisions and empower the government to be able to act on their behalf. Now, the opposition plays a key role in that against the government and the governing party versus, and in the case of a minority parliament or a hung parliament, as it's often referred to in the United Kingdom. But ultimately, it comes down to the fact that there are members of Parliament, 338 of them. And while we do have whips and there are conventions when it comes to voting and voting for confidence measures, and in the case of opposition, we voted non-confidence in the government on a very regular basis, every MP occupies that one seat in the House of Commons. And the power of that, I would suggest, emphasizes the idea of the foundational idea of what privilege is in this place and in this specific context around this table. So I'd like to emphasize how fundamental it is that they're not, and that any attempt to silence members of Parliament from being able to ask the tough questions, to silence members of Parliament from being able to represent their constituents, is not simply an attack on the idea of privilege in this place, but rather is an attack on the fundamental tenets of democracy.
Point of order, Mr. Chair.
Go ahead, on your point of order, Mr. Baines.
Mr. Chair, Mr. Couric is giving us a lesson on how the parliaments are running. What we're talking about is how Mr. Brock said that I furthered and propagated disinformation essentially originating from Beijing and China. That's the motion. That is the false allegation he made. That's what we're talking about here. And I think we need to get on with it.
Yeah, I'm going to I appreciate your point of order. Mr. Couric has the floor, and he knows he's got the floor, Mr. Baines. And, you know, we generally try to give a little bit of latitude. And I expect the same from Mr. Couric, that he's going to bring it back to where it needs to be, specifically on the motion. Go ahead, Mr. Couric, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Chair, and I'm glad that that member is paying such close attention to my remarks, because I think it is what I've been talking about comes down to the absolute crux of the matter. And it is that members of Parliament have to be able to ask tough questions. Now, what that member has suggested Mr. Brock has done, I would suggest, and through the motion that we are debating here today, is an attempt to silence. Now, Mr. Baines has, and he could have moved a motion to further deliberate on the subject of foreign election interference. But he didn't do that. He wants an apology and a retraction. So what is, I think, what is so fundamentally, and the reason why I've provided the information I have, and included, Mr. Chair, some of the exact references that Mr. Baines used in his original argument that he made to you in the meeting on Tuesday. So I find it interesting that he would somehow suggest that the evidence that he provided, that I've expanded on, is somehow not relevant. The irony of that is certainly rich. But what I would like to bring it back to is exactly the point that I was endeavoring to make. When we attempt to silence a member, it is an attack on the very fundamental tenet of what our democratic system is. And when it comes to the issue at hand, and that is the very real allegations of election interference, very real. Mr. Chu, when he came and testified before this committee, was protected by the same privileges that we are protected by around this table. Mr. Baines, also protected by those parliamentary privilege. Mr. Brock, also protected by that parliamentary privilege. We have to ask those tough questions because, as I have talked about before, that every Canadian needs the foundational element that allows democracy to work is that Canadians have to be able to trust that when they take that single ballot that they get into a voting booth and they mark it and they put it in the ballot box, they have to be able to trust that it was a free and fair process. And there have been serious allegations that have been made where that include Mr. Baines, that include other constituencies. But, Mr. Chair, I would like to highlight something, that when Mr. Baines originally brought forward some of his concerns, he made false and misleading allegations. Now, you don't see me calling a point of order on that, but specifically, he talked about firearms. And he made a accusation that was patently false, undeniably and patently false. I didn't call a point of privilege on that, because we're allowed to have free and fair discussion around this table, and we should have that. So let's have those debates. So, Mr. Chair, what I would suggest is that this is a continuation of a trend. There is, it's an intricacy, actually, that I talk often about my constituents, because I will share with this committee that I have many constituents that are so frustrated that they share with me how they feel like they are giving up on the idea and the notion of Canada. Now, that's a pretty significant statement to make, but I share that because that's something that I hear. And it is examples like this committee, Chair, is one of the proof points that I use that Canada's not worth giving up on, that our institutions are not worth giving up on. I explained some aspects, as I've shared before, the ability for members of Parliament to represent their constituents, the rights and privileges that we have, the strength of our democratic system and how we are working to ensure that's protected. But it's the structure of this committee, and I believe that there's 4 of them which are referred to as oversight committees in Parliament. And for those who are watching, they may not be aware of some of the structure to which they work. There are, I believe, and don't quote me on this, Chair, but I believe there's 30 or so standing committees. Then there's also special committees, which are temporary. They only last for a parliament, although can be reconstituted after a new parliament is formed, as we see, and of which I am a member of the Special Committee on Canada-China Relations. But there are 4 committees that have a chair that is a member not of the government, but of the official opposition. And the reason why I highlight that is because I think it shows that there is strength in aspects of our system that are designed to ensure that when a regular Canadian looks at our parliamentary institution, they can say, okay, we can trust that. That is not simply a historical building with green roofs, although being that they've been replaced in the last couple of decades, they're brown for now, but that they do turn green over time. What is I think needs to be emphasized is that there are 4 committees where there are opposition chairs. Now, the chair of a committee operates in a way that is meant to be fair and impartial, and I thank the chair of this committee for doing that. As I have worked with chairs that have been operating, I know there's at least one other committee chair sitting around this table, and I know I've worked with. In fact, I was having a conversation with one of my colleagues from another opposition party just before, and I hope it's okay that I mention this, but that there was a individual who was very partisan in the House of Commons, but that I was pleased at how fairly they adjudicated a committee that I was recently a part of. And I would hope that that individual would take that as a compliment. But it's the fact that our standing order and tradition, Mr. Chair, allows for and ensures that there are 4 committees, what are referred to as the oversight committees, that have opposition chairs. And what I fear, and because of not only the happenings at this committee, the Ethics Committee, which often when I share with people that I'm on the Ethics Committee, the lack of trust in government is emphasized when quite often people will chuckle at the fact that I sit on an Ethics Committee because they're so frustrated when they look at the actions of the Liberal government and the lack of ethics thereof. But the fact that there is an opposition chair, and then a vice chair, in this case from the Liberals, and a second vice chair from the Bloc Québécois. It speaks to how there is strength in the structures that exist. And what I find so troubling is that there seems to be this trend from government members to not allow oversight committees to do their work, but rather we are seeing that committees are bogged down by attempts from the government to slow or stall the work that oversight committees can and I would suggest should do. And let me share with you why I find that so troubling, especially in the context of where we're at in a minority parliament. The fact that there is an opposition chair, and in the case of every committee right now, there is an opposition majority on committees, just as in the House of Commons. And I'll park the NDP support for the government here. But the fact that that structure exists should be something that is championed by those who promote Canadian democracy. And I would suggest it is so very troubling when we see attempts by the government, and often backed up by the NDP, to reduce the ability of these oversight committees to be able to do their work. And that work, Mr. Chair, includes asking the tough questions. Because while the Prime Minister Trudeau, and his government govern like they're in a majority, govern like they have this resounding mandate from the people, when you simply look at the last election, you can see how patently false that is. To the point where, for now 2 consecutive elections, the Liberals got fewer votes. Now, I'm not suggesting that our system should be changed, that the makeup and whatnot. That's certainly a conversation that can be had. So I'm not suggesting that be a part of this larger conversation. But when it comes to the attitude to which the Liberals should approach governing, I would hope that they would look at the number of people that voted for them in the last election and realize that they have a job to do to make sure that the party that actually received the most votes, which was the Conservative Party, that there is great care taken to respect the fact that we don't always agree, and that there are differences of opinion, and that there is a need for answers. We saw in the lead up to the 2019 election, the SNC-Lavalin affair explode. And it was, and I won't relitigate the specifics of that, although certainly we could, because it bears more and more relevance all the time, especially as we see some of the dynamics of that still playing out to this day. But we have an example where there was the ethical conduct of the government and many of its ministers, and then the direction to which, so in the 2019 election, Canadians sent a minority parliament to town. Yet, you had the government and with the pandemic and everything associated with that, they certainly didn't operate as a minority, which is too bad. Because I think if they'd had a little bit more respect, things wouldn't be as divisive as they are today. Then in 2021, we had literally, and I'll share with you, Mr. Chair, and in this committee, and people watching, how disappointed I was in the conduct of the Prime Minister. I remember very specifically that in, I believe it was June of 2021, that the Prime Minister and his government, all Liberal members, said that they would not call an election. They voted as such, because it was a difficult time for the country. We were still in the throes of COVID. There was increasing division over certain aspects of that, some of which were being weaponized by the very public figures that were trusted to make decisions on behalf of all Canadians, which they weren't, and we saw the consequences of that in the following months after that 2019 election. We had only 2 months later, 2.5 months later, that the Prime Minister called an election. 2.5 months before, he promised that he wouldn't. 2.5 months later, he called an election. And it was one of, I would suggest, the most divisive elections that maybe the country's ever seen. And I won't go into great detail about that, although certainly it bears a further discussion if members of the committee would suggest so. Where we saw some of the challenges when it comes to foreign election interference be brought to light. But we had that the result of that was an almost exact, not quite, there was a few changes. I know Conservatives picked up a few seats in Atlantic Canada, the Liberals picked up a few seats in BC. There was a few other changes in Ontario and Alberta, but largely the makeup of the House of Commons was fairly similar. But what did the Liberals do? Instead of trying to pursue an agenda that focused on the fact that once again they lost the popular vote, Conservatives won the popular vote. Now that doesn't necessarily suggest that the makeup of the House of Commons should be different than it is. But you would think that a leader that cared about unifying the country would take great pains to acknowledge that fact. Yet, when I've brought that very fact up in the House of Commons, there are Liberal members, and I could point them out, and I'm sure that even Liberal members probably know who I'd be referring to, that they laugh about the popular vote suggestion. I'm not suggesting there should be a change in the seat makeup, Chair, but I think it bears mentioning. And the reason is this, and why it's so germane to the conversation that we're having today about the attempt to use a privilege motion to essentially censure a member of the opposition, is because a leader would ensure that the voices around the table have a chance to speak. But it comes back to that fundamental point where the Prime Minister and his government, those who are calling the shots in the PMO, a building not too far from here, they don't want an opposition to ask tough questions. They want an audience that applauds, that is lily-livered at best, and is not able to be effective. Well, I can tell you, Mr. Chair, that under the leadership of a member from Carleton, Pierre Poilievre, we are not going to back down from doing the job that Canadians sent us to Parliament to do. We're not going to back down. Which is why I find it so concerning that when the Liberals have now obviously realized that, because the member from Carleton, the leader of the official opposition, is not one that's going to back down. Neither is the member from Brantford-Brant, Mr. Brock. He's not going to back down. It is clear that that is in fact the case. So, Mr. Chair.
Excusez, Mr. Curry.
Point of order. Apologies, Mr. Craig. Mr. Villemur has a point of order. Yes, thank you, Chair. I am quite interested in the speech by my colleague, but it is past 1 o'clock, and I do believe that we should adjourn the meeting. We have until 1:30. We have the resources until 1:30. Are you proposing a motion to adjourn? I just wanted to bring up this fact. I would like to apologize to other members of the committee. We have resources until 1:30 because we had to suspend occasionally. And so we will be going until 1:30. At 1:30, the meeting, or rather we will be out of resources.
Mr. Kirk, go ahead. You have the floor, sir. Go ahead.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and I appreciate that clarification as well. So the point that I was attempting to make is that now that the governing Liberals, supported by the New Democrats, seem to have realized that Conservatives are not going to back down, that we are going to do the job that Canadians sent us here to do, and that we are going to do it passionately. Because quite frankly, when it comes to, and I can't speak for everybody, but when it comes to the passion to which I bring to the job, it is exactly the passion that I believe my constituents expect of me to bring to the job. that they want me to defend their interests, whether that be the energy industry, of which I will talk about extensively, not in the context of this committee, but I have and will continue to do so, including oil and gas. Or when it comes to the agricultural sector, of which I'm not only proud to be from a farming family, but so very proud of the area that I represent, which provides so much food to the world. Or whether it be the institutions of Parliament and the need for that strong democracy that I believe that all Canadians, and I would hope all parliamentarians, want. But there has been a clear and concerted effort, it seems. Certainly, this is the trend. And I would invite members from the government to explain their actions if this is not in fact the case. And I would hope that they would be on the speaking list to be able to do that. But Mr. Chair, what we see is that when it comes to the oversight committees that I've referenced, there seems to be this effort to bog them down with anything but the issues of actually providing oversight. And I'll expand on one example that I believe is very prescient, and that is when we when we had the information commissioner and a meeting scheduled over the last break week. And I know that it's not always convenient, and I had a series of different obligations back in the constituency, but when that meeting got scheduled, I was pleased to be able to join it. Now, I did join virtually, as is an option under the rules that Parliament has passed allowing for virtual participation. There were some Conservative members here in person. I was able to join from one of my constituency offices. And instead of being able to do the work that had been outlined for that should not have been a surprise to anyone, it was shut down after the first round of questions. To the Information Commissioner, the independent officer of Parliament that is tasked at making sure that Canadians' quasi-constitutional right of accessing information is upheld. And what I would suggest is that that was not only an egregious act by the government supported by the NDP, but we see now that when they're not getting their way, it's almost like they're simply going to throw tantrums. And as a result, we see the sort of tactics that we have here. But and I hope, and as this further discussion, and just to enlighten members of this committee, I think that part of the reason why expansive discussion on this is required, because like in the case of a debate on privilege in the House of Commons, the debate on those matters a great deal. And certainly my hope would be that there is the context to which I'm providing, whether it be the historical or whether it be the contemporary political context, it is key to ensure, including highlighting the false claim that Mr. Baines made about firearms in the context of the explanation that he initially made in regards to why he was moving that. So there is and on page 112, again, in the House of Commons Procedure and Practice, 3rd edition, on page 112, there is a quote from Speaker Fraser that was made in 1987. And the privileges of a member are violated when any action which might impede him or her in the fulfillment of his or her duties and functions. Impede, I'll get back to that word in a minute. Because it is that word, the impeding of the ability for a member to fulfill their duties and functions. This motion is attempting to do that. This motion is attempting to impede. Now, I understand that it may be uncomfortable for some members of this committee. And quite frankly, the opposition should make a government uncomfortable regardless of which party is in government. That's the point. And I would hope that there would be widespread agreement about that. asking the tough questions is okay. And it should, in fact, be encouraged. And the quote from Speaker Fraser continues, "It is obvious that the unjust damaging of a reputation could constitute such an impediment." What I would suggest, Mr. Chair, is that when we're asking these tough questions in debate, it is fair game. But to then try and use parliamentary procedure, the standing orders which permit a committee to function, the fact that a member would attempt to use the heavy hand of the majority of a committee, or the attempt to anyways, to silence a member, I would suggest is is a push that ultimately would impede a member from being able to fulfill his duties. And I think that that's where we have this, it seems to be, and I would hope that not all Liberals would be on this page. I would hope that there are those that would even appreciate the work that the opposition does. I would hope that's the case anyways. Because when it comes to my deep respect for democracy in our institutions, and like Pierre Poilievre said to President Biden, that opposition in Canada is an act of loyalty. That can and that should be emphasized again. We can ask those tough questions, whether that be here in this committee, whether that be in the House of Commons. And, Mr. Chair, I would suggest that it goes beyond this. We are protected by privilege in the circumstances, parliamentary discourse and debate. And there's been extensive, actually, including court procedures and whatnot, that define what some of the limits of that are. And I'm sure that well, in fact, I know that the place for those discussions is at PROC when it comes to the specifics of that. And there's been, in fact, I believe it went, I'm not sure if it went to the Supreme Court, but certainly went through an extensive court process when it comes to some accusations against previous members. But what is, there is the effort that, or the point that can and I believe should be made is that we have the obligation as members of Parliament, and I speak about this often to constituents. You know, and I actually shared this a few weeks ago. I am proud that I've never asked somebody who walks through my constituency door who they voted for. You know why that's the case, Mr. Speaker, or Mr. Chair? Is because I care deeply about every constituent to which I serve. Now, I have very frank conversations with all of my constituents, those many of whom I agree with, and from rural Alberta, people will not be surprised that there's often a lot of agreement when it comes to the political issues that Conservatives care a lot about, whether it be issues surrounding firearms or freedoms or energy or agriculture, many of these things. But I still take great pains. In fact, it was had somebody, a fairly new Canadian, had only been a Canadian for a few years, walked through my constituency office door, and I happened to be there. And in a large rural constituency, sometimes that's just a pure stroke of luck, because I'm often in communities. I represent around 60 different communities. I have 2 constituency offices. I wish I could have a constituency office in every community, but that's just not feasible. So over that 53,000 square kilometers, I spend a lot of time on the road, traveling between different offices and whatnot. But Chair, when this fairly new Canadian walked through the door, almost with hesitation, they needed help with a concern about a federal government program. They said, "But I didn't vote for you. Is it okay that I'm here?" And what was so profound in that moment? And we had a fairly extensive conversation about the issue, and then we talked about some other things, including what would constitute pretty serious policy differences. So and that's okay. We had a very frank and appreciated conversation. I appreciated the conversation. The constituent as well appreciated the conversation. And my suspicion is they're probably not going to vote for me in the next election. And that's okay. That's okay, because that's what democracy is about. That's why we have a secret ballot. But Chair, what was encouraging, I hope, for that constituent, is that when they said, but I didn't vote for you, my first response was, that's okay, regardless of who you voted for. You don't need to tell me. I want to serve you. I want to help you. I care about your feedback. And whether it's replying to correspondence, whether it's conversations I have at town halls, that is a key aspect of what makes our democracy strong. In fact, it's a troubling thing. This is more of a societal conversation, Chair, that I would suggest needs to be addressed in the context of not only parliamentary process and procedure and the debates we have here, but I would suggest it needs to be addressed at kitchen tables and classrooms and whatnot. But disagreement does not equal hatred. And I would hope that that is an opinion that would be shared by all members of this committee, that we can disagree on things. And again, it's one of those things where we should. In fact, I often joke, and I shared it at a town hall that I hosted recently where somebody was asking me very specific questions and I was answering, and we disagreed about something. And I said, good, that's okay. That's part of what democracy is about. And I emphasized how, when it comes down to it, I would imagine that every person in the context of that room in that small town in rural Alberta, probably every single person, even some of the husbands and wives, well, certainly husbands and wives when it comes to disagreement, areas of disagreement, that would be the case. But when it comes to every single issue, there would be this, you'd find things that you agree with and you'd find things that you disagree with. So when it comes to the motion at hand, Mr. Chair, the attempt to see, and we have coming to committee next week, on Tuesday, the plan is that we will have Minister Boissonnault coming to answer questions about the conduct to which a company that he is a principal of and the contracts that they received. And what is concerning about the timing
Point of order, Mr. Chair.
of the issue that we have before us.
Go ahead on your point of order, Mr. Fisher.
Thank you very much. And as much as I'm enjoying the member's speech, I know you said that we have resources till 1:30. I would be interested in the chair's thoughts on how we'll be proceeding with this. Will we be coming back with the same speaking order? Page 154 said this gets priority for the committee, this privilege motion. So would that be the expectation of the chair, that you'll be resuming this meeting with the exact same speaking order so everybody that's got their hands up can speak?
So I can get back to you on that, Mr. Fisher, if you don't mind, and I'll do that before the meeting does adjourn. But I'm going to go back to Mr. Kirk. I'm just going to seek clarification from the clerk. I'm pretty sure I know what the answer is, but I just want to be sure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Mr. Kirk.
I appreciate that. So here we have the government, a member of the Liberal Party, the governing party, has moved a motion. When we have clear questions that need to be asked of a senior minister of the Crown, what happens to be the only member of cabinet from Alberta, there are two, out of the 34 seats in Alberta, there are 2 Liberals elected and 2 New Democrats. The rest are Conservatives. And one of the concerns that I would suggest, and this trend is, if it was a one-off, it could be explained just in passing, happenstance or circumstance or whatever the case is. But there has been a clear effort to bog down oversight committees with things that do not have that significant impact on getting Canadians the answers they deserve on the conduct of their government. So what's the practical implications of that? Well, I hope, Mr. Chair, that as the committee agreed to, that Minister Boissonnault will be able to testify, because I think that answers to some of the questions that Canadians have need to be brought forward. And what is I think why that's not only relevant in terms of what's required for the operations of a committee like the Ethics Committee, but what is key here, and why I would suggest that this motion is simply an attempt to censure a member from asking tough questions is that instead of conservatives or liberals, could be a liberal member as well that could ask a tough question, any attempt to limit the ability of that to take place is certainly very, very concerning. And, Mr. Chair, I think what needs to be highlighted in the context of this is that when some of the allegations have been made, when we've talked about some of the evidence, whether that be Justice Hoag's report, whether that be what the Prime Minister himself has said, and the very much a changing story. In fact, I would just highlight something that I think it hasn't received the press that it deserves. But what the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff, when asked about if the Prime Minister reads everything, she said very clearly that he did. Yet it was, I believe, in some of the interviews associated with foreign election interference, where the Prime Minister said very clearly that he didn't. And how I found it very concerning, that disconnect. That you would have the Prime Minister's, the top boss, so to speak, the Chief of Staff of the Prime Minister. And for anybody who's operated in political circles in either Canada or the United States or the United Kingdom, and I'm sure this is the case in other countries, the Chief of Staff of the leader of the government, whether that be the Prime Minister or whether that be the President. In fact, it was Ronald Reagan who brought forward, and of course they have a different system, but had given his Chief of Staff cabinet-level standing in for sure his first term, and I'm not, off the top of my head, I don't remember all the specifics of that, but that's how much authority the Chief of Staff wields. And when you receive a call from, and I'm sure that if there's any political staffers in the room that have received a call from the Chief of Staff, I tell you, it's quite something. But there is significant power that Chief of Staff has, and the Chief of Staff of the Prime Minister made a very clear statement. It was definitive. It wasn't even said he tries to, or he references, or whatever the case is. There's 100 ways that you could have said what she said. But when the Prime Minister was asked a similar question related to briefings, security briefings, about pressing matters that had called into question direct contradictions in the way that he had acted when his political when there would have been the possibility of impacting him politically, there was a clear different type of response. Now, when it comes to, so I believe that bears highlighting in this context, because it's that sort of attitude that filters down. So what is the direction that's been given to maybe liberal members, parliamentary secretaries, that are suggesting maybe that there is this need to slow down or the need for oversight committees to not function as they should, or that there needs to be these motions that take up time, or whatever the case is, or the fact that we have the federal government's use of technological tools capable of extracting personal data from mobile devices and computers. The fact that that report is sitting in not necessarily in limbo, but will be delayed because we're not able to, we're now 2 meetings where that's been listed as a topic that we were to have discussed. And generally, although there's certainly exceptions to this, sometimes reports are gone through when it's less controversial. It can go through, you can go through them quite quickly. Sometimes it takes an extended period of time when, whether it's a more controversial matter or maybe there was some contradictions in testimony. But the fact that we have now for 2 meetings been inhibited in our ability to actually get this stuff done. And I would highlight again, Mr. Chair, that one of the issues that I would expect has seized this committee is the documents that had been requested at a meeting a number of weeks ago. And I believe it was the New Democrats that had requested those documents, if I'm recalling correctly.
Point of order, Mr. Chair. It's very clear that Mr. Couric is just talking out the clock. Is there a chance that you can back off a couple of minutes before you adjourn?
I plan on.
So that we can bring this to a vote, because we're ready to vote if you folks
Well,
are.
he still has the floor.
Understood, but he's talking about a waste of time, and we could get this to a vote today so that we can move with our regular agenda
As
starting.
long as he has the floor, Mr. Fisher.
Fair enough.
He's allowed to continue.
Thank you.
So I can't call for the vote as long as somebody's got the floor, so. And I'm working on the answer that you were looking for.
Thank you.
So I will expect that I'm going to have to cut Mr. Couric off in a couple of minutes just to provide you with the answer, and then we'll move on from there. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Chair, and I appreciate that, because if certainly there was a willingness of Liberal members, including that member, we could have had a very productive last two meetings that would have not been talking about the need to ensure that members, including the member from Brantford Brant, and all members of this committee, and that's something that I would just emphasize here, and hopefully I can make this point very, very briefly. One of the things about the protection of privilege is that it does apply to all members. So I would ask all members of this committee and all those who are watching to consider this carefully. That if they're okay with a member being silenced because they ask tough questions, then this is a reasonable path forward. But I'm not comfortable with that, Chair. And that includes members of the government, members of the opposition, the official opposition, and the two other opposition parties here. Further to that, I find it somewhat rich coming from that member that I believe it was him that moved to adjourn a committee meeting that was scheduled during a break that would have had the opportunity to ensure that this committee could be productive. So it's interesting that they would be so critical of the fact that I believe, and I am certainly hopeful, that the case that I have made emphasizes the need to ensure that we do not allow a committee member to be censured for asking tough questions. That's what it comes down to here. We need to make sure that MPs are allowed to question their government, as is a fundamental tenet of our democratic system. And when it comes to the work that committees need to do, absolutely we need to get to work. As I'm proud to have been able to do so during the course of the committee here today, and will be happy to do each and every opportunity that I have. But when it comes to the hypocrisy that exists, that you would have that member suggest that somehow it's not relevant to talk about the need to protect members so that they can question his boss, Mr. Speaker, I think that question answers itself. So, Mr. Chair, let's make sure that as we are tasked as members of Parliament and this unwritten rule, in fact, I had a chance to meet a constituent, a former Olympic coach, actually, and she gave me a card that she hands out to everybody she meets. She says, "Leave it better than you found it." So my exhortation to every member of this committee is let's make sure we leave it better than we found it, and that includes the rules
you still have the floor,
of
sir,
this
but I'm going
committee.
to have to cut you off for a sec. We are running out of time, resources, as I mentioned at 1:30 earlier in the meeting. To answer Mr. Fisher's point, we are debating a motion to refer this to the House. We are not debating a motion of privilege. So the motion can be brought up at a future meeting as long as members agree to that. So as it stands right now, the resources have expired, and I am going to adjourn the meeting. Thank you.